What if I told you that a homeless girl dying on a park bench possessed a power that could resurrect a fallen empire? Have you ever met someone who changed your entire life in just one conversation? Someone so unexpected that their very existence rewrote everything you thought you knew about success, failure, and what really matters. We've all heard stories of CEOs who lost everything overnight. Stock market crashes, hostile takeovers, scandals that destroyed decades of work in a matter of hours. But what happens when their salvation comes from the most impossible source? A 12-year-old girl with no family, no money, and no future. This is the story of Silas Emery, a man who commanded Silicon Valley boardrooms and business headlines for over a decade. The founder of Emery Tech Group didn't just build a company. He built an empire worth $300 million. His innovations made him a legend. His ruthless tactics made him untouchable. His brilliant mind made him wealthy beyond most people's wildest dreams. But even the mightiest empires can crumble in a single day. When a catastrophic attack destroyed everything Silas had spent 15 years building, he lost more than money. He lost his wife, his friends, his reputation, and his will to keep fighting. The man who once graced magazine covers found himself alone in a cramped apartment, nursing bitterness and wondering how his life had gone so wrong. Then came that stormy winter night when fate led him to a city park. When he discovered a frail figure huddled by a bench, shivering in the cold, he had no idea he was looking at his salvation. The dying girl he rescued that night would teach him lessons no business school ever covered. She would show him that true power doesn't come from bank accounts or stock prices. What he discovered about that dying girl would rewrite everything he thought he knew about miracles. Because Milagros, everyone called her Millie, wasn't just fighting for her life. She was blessed with something divine, something that would transform a broken billionaire into a man who understood what wealth really means. If you ever felt like life knocked you down just when you thought you had it all figured out, hit that like button. Because Silas's journey from the penthouse to the pavement to something far greater might just change how you see your own challenges. This isn't just a story about losing everything. It's about discovering that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. And sometimes, when you think you're saving someone else, they're actually saving you. To understand how far Silas Emery fell, you first need to see just how high he had climbed. In 2018, Forbes called him the Algorithm King. TechCrunch featured him on their cover with the headline, "The Mind That Never Sleeps." Silas didn't just run Emery Tech Group. He was the beating heart of innovation that kept Silicon Valley on its toes. His company specialized in data analytics software that could predict market trends with frightening accuracy. Fortune 500 companies paid millions just to license his algorithms. Investment firms begged him to analyze their portfolios. Government agencies quietly contracted his services for projects they'd never admit publicly. Silas owned 3 homes: a glass mansion overlooking the Pacific in Malibu, a penthouse in Manhattan that cost more than most people's lifetime earnings, and a sprawling estate in the Napa Valley where he hosted legendary parties for tech industry royalty. His garage housed a collection of supercars that read like a wish list: Lamborghinis, Ferraris, a custom McLaren that he'd had designed specifically for him. But the real symbol of his success wasn't material. It was the way rooms went quiet when he entered. CEOs who commanded their own empires suddenly became eager students when Silas shared his insights. Venture capitalists who turned down $100 million deals daily would clear their schedules for a 30-minute coffee with him. His wife, Pilar, was a perfect complement to his success, brilliant in her own right as a corporate lawyer, stunningly beautiful, and socially connected in ways that opened doors even Silas's wealth couldn't reach. They were the power couple that graced charity galas and exclusive events, the kind of pair that made other successful people feel envious. From the outside, their marriage looked flawless. Designer clothes, exotic vacations, a social calendar filled with the most influential people in the world. Pilar wore jewelry that cost more than luxury cars, and she wore it well. Their penthouse was featured in Architectural Digest. Their lifestyle was the stuff of dreams. But success at Silas's level came with a price that few people understood. To stay on top, he had to be ruthless. Competitors weren't just business rivals. They were obstacles to be crushed. Employees weren't family. They were resources to be optimized. Even friendships became transactional, measured by what each person could contribute to his continued dominance. Silas made enemies without even trying. When smaller companies threatened his market share, he didn't just outcompete them, he destroyed them completely. When former employees tried to start their own ventures using knowledge they gained at Emory Tech, he buried them in lawsuits until they gave up. When business partners became inconvenient, he found ways to push them out of deals that left them with nothing. He told himself it was just business. In the tech world, you either dominate or get dominated. There was no middle ground for someone with his ambitions. The isolation crept in so gradually that Silas barely noticed it happening. Late nights at the office became normal. Business dinners replaced family time. Even his conversations with Pilar started revolving around deals, acquisitions, and market movements instead of personal connection. But why would he complain? His net worth had crossed $300 million. His company's valuation was approaching $1 billion. Investment banks were already whispering about taking Emory Tech public, which would make him one of the youngest billionaires in Silicon Valley history. Success has a way of making us feel invincible. When you're winning every game, it becomes impossible to imagine losing. When every bet pays off, you start believing you can't fail. When every door opens for you, you forget that some doors can slam shut just as quickly. Silas had no idea that his greatest enemy wasn't a competitor trying to steal his market share. It wasn't a government regulator looking to break up his dominance. It wasn't even a disgruntled employee planning revenge. His greatest enemy was someone who knew exactly where to strike to bring his entire world crashing down. Someone who had been watching, waiting, and planning the perfect moment to destroy everything he'd built. But on this particular morning, as Silas reviewed quarterly reports that showed record-breaking profits, he felt nothing but confidence that feeling would last exactly 47 more minutes. The call came at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Silas was reviewing acquisition targets in his corner office when his head of security burst to the door without knocking, something that had never happened in 15 years of working together. In his unshakable empire, "Sir, we have a problem. A big one." The words that followed would replay in Silas's mind for years to come. "Someone's inside our system. They've been there for months. And they just took everything." Within the first hour, Silas understood the scope of the attack. This wasn't random cybercrime or opportunistic hacking. Someone had studied Emory Tech security architecture for months, mapping every weakness, identifying every vulnerability, planning the perfect strike. The attacker hadn't just stolen data. They had systematically destroyed it. 7 years of client projects, gone. Proprietary algorithms worth hundreds of millions of dollars, wiped clean. Backup servers that should have been impenetrable, completely corrupted. But the real genius of the attack was in its timing. The breach was designed to go public just as Emory Tech was finalizing its biggest government contract in company history. Within minutes of the discovery, news outlets were already reporting the story with details that only someone on the inside could have known. By noon, Silas's phone was ringing nonstop, not with offers of help or expressions of support, but with contract cancellations. Clients who had trusted Emory Tech with their most sensitive data were terminating agreements as fast as their legal teams could draft the paperwork. The stock price began its death spiral immediately. Emory Tech had been trading at $847 per share that morning. By market close, it had dropped to $312. The next day, $198. By the end of the week, $43. Silas watched 15 years of work evaporate in real time. Investment firms that had courted him for years suddenly wouldn't return his calls. Board members who had praised his vision were now demanding his resignation. The media that had once celebrated him as a genius now dissected his every decision like amateur forensic analysts. The lawsuits came next. Clients seeking damages for lost data. Shareholders filing class action suits. Government agencies launching investigations into security practices. Legal fees that started in the thousands quickly climbed into the millions. Silas had always prided himself on being prepared for any scenario. He had insurance policies, emergency funds, contingency plans. But nothing could have prepared him for the speed and completeness of his company's destruction. Within 6 weeks, Emory Tech Group was finished. The company that had once been valued at nearly $1 billion was sold for parts to cover debts. Silas was forced to liquidate everything: the Malibu mansion, the Manhattan penthouse, the Napa estate. The supercar collection went to auction. Even family heirlooms that had been passed down for generations were sold to pay legal settlements. But the cruelest blow came from Pilar. The woman who had stood beside him at charity galas and exclusive events couldn't handle the scrutiny that came with his fall. The photographers who had once captured their glamorous lifestyle now camped outside their remaining properties, hunting for shots of the disgraced CEO and his wife. "I can't do this anymore, Silas," she told him on a gray morning in their nearly empty penthouse. The phone calls, the reporters, the looks from people we used to call friends. "I didn't sign up for this." She was gone by the end of the week, taking only her personal belongings and leaving behind a marriage that had lasted 8 years but couldn't survive 8 weeks of adversity. The friends followed soon after. Dinner invitations stopped coming. Golf partners became mysteriously busy. People who had once competed for his attention now crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. Silas found himself alone in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood he'd never even noticed during his years of success. The man who had once commanded boardrooms full of executives now spent his days staring at financial statements that showed his complete ruin. The bitterness consumed him slowly, like poison working through his system. He replayed every decision, every missed warning sign, every moment when he might have prevented the disaster. Sleep became elusive. Appetite disappeared. The world outside his apartment felt hostile and unforgiving. If you know someone who's been knocked down by life, share this story with them. Because sometimes we all need to remember that rock bottom can become the foundation for something completely unexpected. But Silas had no way of knowing that his salvation was already out there, waiting for him in the most unlikely form. All he knew was that the empire he'd spent 15 years building had been destroyed by an enemy who had planned his downfall with the same precision he'd once used to destroy his own competitors. The hunter had become the hunted. The predator had become the prey. And the man who had never shown mercy was about to discover what it felt like to need it desperately. 3 months after losing everything, Silas had developed a routine that kept him sane, barely. Every evening, when the walls of his small apartment felt like they were closing in, he would walk, not with any destination in mind, just movement to quiet the voices in his head that replayed every mistake, every missed warning sign, every moment when he could prevent his downfall. On this particular February night, the weather matched his mood perfectly. Rain hammered the city streets with unusual violence, driven by winds that bent trees and sent trash cans rolling down empty sidewalks. Most people had the sense to stay indoors, but Silas welcomed the storm. The external chaos felt honest compared to fake sympathy and awkward silences he encountered when people recognized him. He pulled his worn jacket tighter and kept walking, rain soaking through the thin fabric. The jacket had cost him $40 at a discount store, a far cry from the custom suits that used to fill his walk-in closet. His shoes, once exclusively Italian leather, were now waterlogged sneakers that squeaked with every step. The city park appeared through the downpour like a gray ghost. Lincoln Park had been one of his favorite shortcuts during his executive days, when he'd ride through in the back of his Tesla on the way to important meetings. Now he walked through at ground level, seeing details he'd never noticed from behind tinted windows. That's when he spotted something that made him stop. Near a bench under a broken streetlight, a small figure was huddled against the storm. At first, Silas thought it might be a pile of discarded clothes or garbage bags. But then the figure moved slightly, and he realized with growing alarm that someone was out there in this weather. As he moved closer, his steps slowed. It was a child, a girl who couldn't have been older than 12 or 13. She was pressed against the back of the bench, using it as a windbreak, her thin jacket providing almost no protection against the freezing rain. Her dark hair was plastered to her head, and her lips were moving in what looked like silent conversation. But with who? There was no one else around for blocks. Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in months, concern for another person's well-being that had nothing to do with his own problems. "Hey!" he called out, raising his voice over the storm. "Are you okay?" The girl looked up, and Silas saw eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. They were warm brown, but clouded with exhaustion and something deeper, an acceptance of suffering that no child should ever possess. "I'm waiting for my mom," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "She want to find help. I feel so tired." As she spoke, she shifted position, and Silas caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. There was blood on her hand, not from a cut or scrape, but the kind that came from somewhere internal and serious. "How long have you been out here?" Silas asked, kneeling beside the bench despite the puddle that immediately soaked through his jeans. "I don't know," she whispered. "Time feels different when everything hurts." The philosophical weight of her words struck him as odd coming from a child. But there was no time to think about that. She was clearly in medical distress, possibly dying, and sitting in weather that could kill a healthy adult. Without hesitation, Silas pulled out his phone and dialed 911. While he waited for the operator to answer, he shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around the girl's shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was something. 911, what's your emergency? "I need an ambulance at Lincoln Park, the main entrance on 7th Street. There's a child here who's seriously injured and has been exposed to this storm. She's losing blood and maybe going into shock." The girl looked up at him with surprise, as if kindness from strangers was something she stopped expecting long ago. "What's your name?" Silas asked while they waited for help to arrive. "Milagros," she said softly, "but everyone calls me Millie." "Well, Millie, help is coming. You're going to be okay." She managed a weak smile. "You don't have to stay. Most people don't." The words hit Silas harder than they should have. Here was a child who had already learned that people abandon you when things get difficult. A lesson he'd recently learned himself from adults who should have known better. "I'm staying," he said firmly. When the ambulance arrived, Silas rode with them to the hospital. He filled out forms listing himself as Good Samaritan, since Millie didn't seem to have any identification or emergency contacts. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years being anything but good to the people around him, and now a stranger was calling him exactly that. In the emergency room, while doctors worked to stabilize Millie, Silas learned her story from an overwhelmed social worker who looked like she hadn't slept in days. Millie was a foster child with no permanent family. She'd been bounced between homes for most of her life, never staying anywhere long enough to feel settled. 3 months ago, she'd been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a blood cancer that was particularly aggressive in her case. Her prognosis was devastating. Without intensive treatment that the state system was struggling to provide, she had maybe 6 months to live. The social worker explained that Millie had a habit of disappearing from temporary placements when the medical treatments became too overwhelming. "She's been in the hospital 4 times this month," the social worker said wearily. "Each time, she improves just enough to be released to a new foster home. Then she runs away again when it's time for chemotherapy." As Silas listened to this litany of abandonment and medical crisis, something unexpected happened. For the first time in months, his own problem seemed small by comparison. Here was a child facing death with more grace than he'd shown while facing bankruptcy. A girl who had every reason to be bitter about life's unfairness, yet still managed to smile at a stranger who showed her basic human kindness. Silas told himself he would visit Millie just once, to check that she was okay after that terrible night in the park. That single visit turned into 2, then 3. Then every Tuesday at 2 p.m. became sacred time that nothing else was allowed to interrupt. The pediatric oncology ward at St. Mary's Hospital was unlike any environment Silas had ever navigated. Gone were the boardrooms where he commanded respect through intimidation and intellect. Here, success was measured differently, in small improvements, in moments of laughter between treatments, in the simple act of showing up when someone needed you. At first, he felt completely out of place. What did a former tech CEO know about comforting a sick child? His conversation skills had been honed for business negotiations and industry conferences, not bedside chats with a 12-year-old fighting for her life. But Millie made it easy. She had a way of asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things without making you feel interrogated. "What made you want to build computer programs?" she asked during a second visit, and somehow Silas found himself talking about his childhood fascination with solving puzzles rather than his usual rehearsed speech about market opportunities and scalable solutions. "I used to take apart my mom's radio just to see how it worked," he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "She got so mad when I couldn't put it back together." Millie laughed, a sound that seemed to brighten the entire sterile room. "Did you ever learn to fix radios?" "No," Silas said, smiling despite himself. "But I learned that some things are more beautiful when you understand what makes them work." It was during his third visit that he brought the chess set. Silas had been a decent player in college, though he'd abandoned the game when business consumed his life. Something about Millie's sharp intelligence made him think she might enjoy learning, and he was right. She picked up the rules with startling speed, asking strategic questions that showed she understood not just how the pieces moved, but why each move mattered. "Chess is like life," she observed during their first game, moving her knight with careful deliberation. "Sometimes you have to sacrifice something valuable to protect something more important." The comment hit Silas harder than it should have. Here was a child who had lost everything: family, health, stability. Yet she spoke about sacrifice as a choice rather than a tragedy. Their games became a weekly ritual. Millie's strategic thinking improved rapidly, but what impressed Silas most was her attitude toward losing. When he captured her queen or put her in checkmate, she would study the board with genuine curiosity, asking him to explain the sequence of moves that had led to her defeat. "I want to understand how you saw what I missed," she would say. "Losing is only bad if you don't learn from it." Silas began bringing art supplies after noticing Millie doodling on hospital napkins during her chemotherapy sessions. Nothing expensive, just colored pencils and sketch pads from the drugstore, but her face lit up as if he'd handed her precious gems. Her drawings revealed an imagination that somehow remained vibrant despite her circumstances. She sketched fantasy landscapes populated by dragons that looked friendly rather than fierce, castles that seemed welcoming rather than forbidding, and people who appeared to be helping each other rather than fighting. "Why are all your dragons smiling?" Silas asked one day, genuinely curious. "Because they're not really scary," Millie explained, adding delicate shading to her latest creature's wings. "People think they're monsters, but maybe they're just misunderstood. Maybe they're actually trying to help." The wisdom in her words made Silas pause. Was she talking about dragons, or about people like him who had been labeled as ruthless and heartless? As the weeks passed, something unexpected began happening. Silas found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, not even Pilar during their marriage. He talked about the pressure of always having to be the smartest person in the room, the loneliness that came with success, the way he gradually pushed away anyone who might have genuinely cared about him. "I made a lot of enemies," he admitted during one of their conversations. "I told myself it was just business, but looking back, I think I enjoyed having power over people who couldn't fight back." Millie listened without judgment, her brown eyes reflecting understanding rather than condemnation. "Maybe you were scared," she said quietly. "Scared of what?" "Of not being good enough. Sometimes when people hurt us, we hurt other people first, so they can't hurt us worse." The simplicity of her insight was devastating. This child, who had every reason to be bitter about life's unfairness, had somehow maintained a kind of empathy that Silas had systematically trained out himself over years of corporate warfare. "How do you do it?" he asked her one day after a particularly brutal treatment that had left her weak and nauseated. "How do you stay so positive when everything is so unfair?" Millie was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think bad things happen to teach us about good things," she finally said. "Like, I never knew how much a friend's visit could mean until I was stuck in this bed. I never knew how brave I could be until I had to be brave every day." She paused, then added something that would stay with Silas forever. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to really see what matters." The hospital staff began to take notice of their unusual friendship. Nurses mentioned how much brighter Millie seemed on Tuesdays. Doctors noted that her pain management improved on the days when Silas visited. Other patients in the pediatric ward started asking if the nice man who plays chess with Millie might visit them too. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was how the friendship was changing Silas himself. The bitterness that had consumed him since his company's collapse began to fade, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten existed. Purpose that had nothing to do with profit margins or personal gain. For the first time in his adult life, he was showing up for someone else without expecting anything in return. And somehow, in caring for Millie, he was healing parts of himself that he hadn't even realized were broken. Comment below and tell us about a time when someone younger or less experienced taught you something profound. Because wisdom doesn't always come with age, and sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. It started with small things that the medical staff couldn't quite explain. Dr. Martinez had been treating pediatric cancer patients for 23 years, and she'd never seen anything like what was happening with Millie. The girl's blood work showed improvements that defied every statistical model and medical projection they had for her condition. Her white cell count should be declining with this aggressive form of leukemia, Dr. Martinez explained to Silas during one of his visits. Instead, her numbers are stabilizing, not improving dramatically, but holding steady in ways that frankly shouldn't be possible. But the medical anomalies were just the beginning. Other patients in the pediatric oncology ward began experiencing unusual improvements whenever they spent time near Millie. A 7-year-old boy with brain cancer started responding better to treatment after Millie began visiting his room to share her colored pencils. A teenage girl with bone cancer reported that her chronic pain decreased significantly during the hours when Millie would sit with her and listen to music. The nursing staff started calling her the miracle child, though they said it with the kind of affectionate bewilderment that healthcare workers develop when they encounter something that doesn't fit their medical training. "It's the strangest thing," Nurse Patricia confided to Silas one afternoon. "We've had patients on this ward for months without showing the kind of progress they make after just a few conversations with Millie. I can't explain it scientifically, but I've stopped trying." Silas began to notice the phenomenon himself during their Tuesday visits. Millie had a presence that seemed to calm not just the patients around her, but their families as well. Worried parents would seek her out for conversations that somehow left them looking more hopeful than when they'd arrived. She never claimed to be doing anything special. When Silas asked her about the improvements other patients seemed to experience, Millie would just shrug with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who didn't yet understand that what seemed natural to her was extraordinary to everyone else. "I just listen to them," she would say. "Everyone wants someone to really hear their story." But there was something deeper happening that went beyond simple compassion. Millie seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of what each person needed to hear. She could sense when someone needed encouragement, when they needed permission to be afraid, or when they simply needed someone to sit quietly beside them. During one of their chess matches, Silas watched her interact with a new patient, a 10-year-old boy named Marcus who had been admitted that morning with a rare form of lymphoma. The child was terrified, crying for his mother, and refusing to let any of the medical staff near him. Millie wheeled her four-stand over to his bed and began drawing on a piece of paper. She didn't speak to Marcus directly, but started narrating her artwork as if she were talking to herself. "This dragon used to be really scared of doctors, too," she said, sketching with focused concentration. "He thought they were trying to hurt him, but then he realized they were actually dragon healers, and they knew special magic that could make the scary feelings go away." Within 10 minutes, Marcus had stopped crying and was asking questions about the dragon. Within an hour, he was allowing the nurses to check his vital signs. By evening, he was asking when he could learn to draw dragons like Millie. "How did you know exactly what to say to him?" Silas asked her later. "I didn't know," Millie replied honestly. "I just felt like he needed to hear about brave dragons." The more time Silas spent observing Millie, the more he realized that her influence extended beyond the hospital walls. During their conversations, he found himself accessing parts of his personality that he'd buried under years of corporate ambition. The man who had once measured success solely in profit margins was rediscovering the satisfaction that came from helping others without expecting anything in return. His own transformation accelerated in ways that surprised him. The guilt and anger that had consumed him since his business collapse began to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. For the first time in his adult life, he was waking up each day focused on how he could be useful to someone else rather than how he could advance his own interests. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Millie's presence was how effortless it all seemed. She wasn't trying to heal people or work miracles. She was simply being herself, a 12-year-old girl who had learned to find joy and meaning despite facing circumstances that would crush most adults. "Do you know what you're doing?" Silas asked her one day, genuinely curious about whether she understood the effect she had on people. Millie considered the question seriously before answering. "I think everyone's light inside them," she said finally. "Sometimes it gets covered up by scary or sad things. Maybe I just help people remember where their light is." As autumn turned to winter, the hospital staff stopped questioning the improvements they witnessed around Millie. They simply accepted that some things couldn't be explained by medical science and focused on documenting the positive outcomes that seemed to follow in her wake. But even miracles, Silas was about to learn, could be tested by circumstances that would challenge everything he thought he understood about faith, hope, and the power of human connection. The night that changed everything began with Millie's most difficult treatment yet. Dr. Martinez had warned Silas that this round of chemotherapy would be particularly aggressive. Millie's cancer had shown signs of advancing despite her remarkable resilience, and the medical team was escalating to treatments that would push her young body to its absolute limits. Silas arrived at the hospital that evening to find Millie barely conscious, her small frame dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding her bed. For a line snaked across her arms, and monitors beeped with rhythms that seemed far too fast for someone so still. "The treatment hit her harder than we expected," Nurse Patricia explained quietly. "She's been drifting in and out for the past 6 hours." Silas pulled his usual chair close to her bedside and settled in for what he knew would be a long night. He'd done this before during her previous difficult treatments, maintaining a vigil that had become as natural to him as breathing. But as the hours passed, Millie's condition seemed to worsen rather than stabilize. Her breathing became more labored. Her skin took on a pallor that made the medical staff exchange worried glances, and the monitors began sounding alarms that brought nurses rushing in every few minutes. Around 3 a.m., Millie slipped into unconsciousness completely. Silas sat in the darkened room, listening to the mechanical sound of machines keeping her alive, and felt a crushing weight of helplessness that transported him back to the worst moments of his business collapse. But this was different. When he'd lost his company, he'd been angry at the world and at his enemies. Now he was angry at himself. What right did he have to care this much about a child he'd known for only a few months? What had he ever done to deserve her friendship? How could he sit here hoping for her recovery when he'd spent years destroying other people's dreams without a second thought? The guilt consumed him as he dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his mind cycling through every ruthless decision he'd made, every competitor he'd crushed, every employee he'd treated as disposable. That's when it happened. Silas found himself standing in a place that felt both foreign and familiar, a space filled with soft, warm light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The hospital room was gone, replaced by an environment that defied description but radiated peace in ways that made his chest ache with unexpected emotion. Millie stood before him, but not as he'd ever seen her before. Gone was the frail, sick child connected to machines and 4 lines. Instead, she appeared healthy and strong, her dark hair shining, her brown eyes bright with an intelligence that seemed to encompass far more than her 12 years should have allowed. Most remarkably, her hands glowed with a gentle, golden light that pulsed like a heartbeat. "You have a good heart, Silas," she said, her voice carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through his entire being. "You just forgot how to use it." The words hit him with a force that brought him to his knees in this strange, light-filled space. Every cruel decision, every ruthless calculation, every moment when he'd chosen profit over people came flooding back with crystal clarity. "I destroyed so many lives," he whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside his chest. "I became everything I used to hate about powerful people." Millie moved closer, and the light emanating from her hands grew brighter, warmer. "Everyone makes mistakes, even big ones. The difference between good people and bad people isn't whether they mess up, it's whether they learn from it." She reached out and touched his forehead with one glowing hand, and Silas felt something he'd never experienced before, complete, unconditional forgiveness washing through him like warm water, dissolving years of self-hatred and regret. "I forgive you, Silas," she said simply. Now you need to forgive yourself. The light around them intensified until everything became pure, brilliant white, and then Silas woke in a hospital chair to find Millie's eyes open, watching him with a faint smile that seemed to hold secrets about the universe itself. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked quietly, her voice hoarse but unmistakably real. For the first time in years, maybe decades, Silas felt truly at peace. The crushing weight of guilt and anger that had defined him since his fall was simply gone, replaced by a calm certainty that everything, somehow, was exactly as it should be. The change in Silas was immediate and impossible to ignore. Within days of his vision, he had transformed his Tuesday hospital visits into something much bigger. He began arriving early and staying late, offering to help other families navigate the overwhelming maze of medical procedures and insurance paperwork that came with having a critically ill child. His business background, once used to outmaneuver competitors, now served families who were drowning in bureaucracy. He helped them understand treatment options, negotiate with insurance companies, and find financial assistance programs they never knew existed. Mr. Emery helped us get approval for Jacob's medication in 3 days. One grateful mother told the hospital staff, "We've been fighting the insurance company for 2 months." But Silas's transformation extended far beyond the hospital walls. He started volunteering at the community center in his modest neighborhood, offering free computer classes to kids whose families couldn't afford expensive technology programs. The same analytical mind that had once designed algorithms worth hundreds of millions of dollars was now teaching 8-year-olds how to create their first PowerPoint presentations. Word of his classes spread quickly through the community. Parents who worked multiple jobs and couldn't afford tutoring began dropping off their children, knowing that Silas would not only teach them valuable skills, but also provide the kind of individual attention their overwhelmed schools couldn't offer. "He's different from other adults," 10-year-old Maria told her mother after her first class. "He actually listens to our ideas instead of just telling us we're wrong." The local newspaper, the City Tribune, got wind of the story when a reporter's daughter attended one of Silas's classes. What started as a small human interest piece about community volunteering turned into something much more significant when the reporter discovered Silas's background. Former tech CEO now teaches kids for free, ran as a front-page story that caught the attention of readers far beyond their usual circulation area. The article detailed his fall from Silicon Valley grace, but focused primarily on his current work helping underserved children develop technical skills. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from strangers who wanted to support his community programming. Other tech professionals reached out, offering to volunteer their expertise. Parents from across the city began asking if their children could attend his classes, even offering to pay tuition that Silas consistently refused to accept. "Education shouldn't be limited to families who can afford it," he told one persistent parent. "If we start charging fees, we lose the kids who need these skills most." Local television stations picked up the story next. Channel 7 News ran a segment called Second Chances that featured interviews with children whose lives had been changed by Silas's patient teaching and mentorship. The segment showed 12-year-old Marcus, the same boy Millie had comforted during his cancer treatment. Working confidently on a computer program he designed to help other kids track their medication schedules. His recovery had been remarkable, and he credited both Millie's friendship and Silas's technical guidance with giving him hope during his darkest period. "Mr. Emery taught me that computers can help people, not just make money," Marcus said during the interview, his words carrying maturity that belied his age. But perhaps the most unexpected response came from someone Silas never expected to hear from again. Delphine Rhodes had been watching the news coverage from her office in downtown Portland, where she'd recently inherited a struggling technology nonprofit from her late aunt. The organization was designed to provide digital literacy training to underserved communities, but had been poorly managed and was on the verge of closing due to lack of direction and expertise. Delphine remembered Silas from their days as competitors in Silicon Valley. She respected his technical brilliance, even while despising his ruthless business tactics. The man she was seeing on television bore little resemblance to the corporate shark who had once tried to acquire her startup through hostile means. This version of Silas Emery was patient, humble, and genuinely focused on helping others rather than advancing his own interests. The transformation was so complete that she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about people's capacity for change. After 3 days of internal debate, Delphine made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. She picked up her phone and called Silas directly. "This is going to sound strange," she said when he answered, "but I've been following your story in the news. I run a nonprofit that could use someone with your technical expertise and your new perspective on community service. Would you be interested in consulting for us?" Silas was quiet for so long that Delphine wondered if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. "Are you sure you want to work with someone who once tried to destroy your business?" "I'm sure I want to work with someone who's learned from his mistakes and is using his skills to help kids who need advocates," Delphine replied. "The question is whether you're interested in taking this work to a larger scale." The opportunity was everything Silas hadn't known he was looking for, a chance to use his expertise meaningfully, to work with someone who understood both his capabilities and his past failures, and to expand the impact he was already having on individual children's lives. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the way Silas's story comes full circle will absolutely blow your mind. Sometimes the people we least expect to